My son looked me in the eye, called me a burden, and tried to trick me into signing away the home my late husband and I had built together. He and his wife isolated me, unplugged my phone, and talked about my cognitive decline right in front of my face, all because they thought I was too old and weak to fight back. But they completely underestimated me. They had no idea that their greed was about to cost them absolutely everything, and that I would deliver my final lesson during one last, perfect family dinner. Sundays in my house always used to smell like slow-cooked pot roast and onions. It was the scent of a week winding down of comfort of a life built with my late husband, Robert. But that Sunday, my home smelled of lemongrass chili and the sharp, unfamiliar scent of expensive takeout. My son Caleb and his wife Alyssa had arrived with a tower of glossy white boxes from some trendy new restaurant in downtown Bellevue. They called it a treat, a way to give me a break. I knew it was a polite rejection of the roast I'd already started preparing that morning. I'd quietly turned off the oven and wrapped it in foil to put in the fridge for later. I watched them from my armchair as they unpacked everything onto my kitchen counter, their movements quick and efficient as if they were optimizing a workflow. That's how they talked. Everything was about optimization, synergy, and bandwidth. Alyssa placed her handbag on the counter, a stark white leather thing that probably cost more than my first car. It looked alien against the warm, worn laminate that Robert and I had picked out 40 years ago. Caleb smiled at me, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'd been seeing that a lot lately. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes pulled tight, with a stress that his successful tech career wasn't supposed to allow. He'd told me he was just trying to manage things to create a more minimalist space for me, that all my old things were becoming a burden. He said it with such kindness, such practiced concern, it was almost believable. We ate at the old oak dining table, the one with a dozen faint water rings that told the story of every family dinner we'd ever had. They talked about their world, a place of quarterly reports and investment opportunities I didn't understand. They spoke about the housing market, how property values in our neighborhood were astronomical, a fact they delivered with a strange mix of pride and hunger. They talked around me mostly like I was a feature of the room, a piece of antique furniture that needed to be politely acknowledged before getting down to business. I just nodded and ate my pad thai, which was good, but it didn't feel like home. After they had packed away the leftovers, Alyssa was very concerned about single-use plastics. Caleb cleared his throat. This was it. The real reason for the visit. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his leather satchel and laid them on the table. He explained it was just a minor document, a formality for the estate plan. He used phrases like streamlining the process and proactive asset management. He said it would make things easier for me, that it would take the burden of financial decisions off my plate, so I could just relax and enjoy my retirement. He was a good son. He said, just trying to be responsible and look out for my future. All I had to do was sign. The document was thick, filled with legal language I couldn't follow, but his voice was so smooth, so reassuring. I told him I'd need to find my reading glasses and look it over properly, a small act of defiance that bought me a little time. As I was clearing the last of the takeout boxes from the table to rinse for recycling, I remembered a small kindness from the week before. I mentioned that I'd received a lovely card from my old friend, Susan Albright. I added that they might remember her a sharp woman who had been a lawyer for 30 years before she retired. Alyssa, who was scrolling through her phone, glanced up for a fraction of a second. She said that was nice, but I really shouldn't let things like that pile up. Clutter, she explained, with the certainty of a wellness guru, adds to your mental stress. She made it sound like an act of kindness, this dismissal of my friend, this tidying up of my life. They left soon after that, promising to come back tomorrow for my signature. I stood at the door and waved as Caleb's sleek electric car purred down the driveway. The silence they left behind was heavy. I gathered up the rinsed plastic containers, the faint smell of chili still clinging to them, and walked through the kitchen to the garage. Trash day is Monday, and Robert had always made sure the bins were out on Sunday night. It was a small routine, a rhythm of a life I was trying to hold on to. As I pushed open the door, I saw Caleb's car was still there, parked just out of sight from the living room window. He was inside, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. The garage door must not have closed all the way, because I could hear his voice, and it wasn't the calm, patient one he used with me. It was raw, thin, and stretched with a panic I had never heard before. "The deadline is Tuesday," he hissed into the phone. "If we don't have control of the asset by then, we lose everything. Just get it done." I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. The cold concrete of the garage floor seemed to seep up into my bones. An asset. He wasn't talking about stock portfolios or investment properties. There was only one asset that mattered, one asset they were so desperate to streamline and manage. It was my house, my home. And suddenly I understood that their concern wasn't for my well-being. It was the desperate hunger of drowning people pulling me under with them. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The words I'd overheard in the garage played over and over in my mind, a toxic loop of betrayal. Control of the asset. We lose everything. My son's voice, stripped of all its practiced warmth, was the voice of a stranger. I lay in the dark in the house Robert and I had built from nothing, and I felt the grief wash over me. It wasn't just for my husband. It was for the son I thought I had, the family I thought was mine. But as the hours ticked by and the moon traced its path across my bedroom ceiling, something else began to crystallize in the pit of my stomach. The shock started to burn away, leaving something hard and cold in its place. A resolve. I had been a wife, a mother, a caregiver. I had been quiet, and they had mistaken my quiet for weakness. That was a mistake they were going to regret. An asset doesn't have feelings. An asset doesn't have a heart to break. But I did, and it had been broken. Now it was time for the asset to show its value. The next morning, Alyssa arrived right on schedule, looking bright and efficient in an expensive yoga outfit that I doubted had ever seen the inside of a studio. She held the folder with the legal documents like a prize, her smile wide and condescending. She said she'd brought my favorite scones and that Caleb had sent his love. He was just so swamped with a big project. She spread the papers on the kitchen table, the same table where my son had once finger-painted and uncapped a pen. She told me it was simple, just a few signatures here, and all my worries would be over. I let her finish, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment too long. I picked up the papers, pretending to squint at the tiny print. Then I looked up, arranging my face into a mask of mild, elderly confusion. I told her that this was all so complicated for an old woman like me. And then I delivered the first carefully aimed stone. I said I was just on the phone this morning with my dear friend Susan Albright, you know, the retired attorney, and we were just chatting about old times. I mentioned that she had said something so curious, something about gift taxes on assets over a certain value. I looked Alyssa right in the eye, my expression one of pure innocence. I asked her if she thought this little arrangement would affect their application for that new golf club membership they were so excited about. It was like watching a film suddenly skip a frame. The bright, polished smile faltered, a flicker of pure panic in her eyes, before she could hide it. She stammered, telling me that wasn't how it worked, that it wasn't a gift, it was a management transfer. The corporate jargon sounded clumsy and ridiculous coming from her now. She made a flimsy excuse about needing to check the time on a meeting and practically ran onto my porch, her phone already pressed to her ear. I watched through the window as she paced her hands, gesturing wildly. A few minutes later, she came back inside, her face pale. She said Caleb would call in a moment to clarify everything. When her phone buzzed, she put it on speaker. Caleb's voice was tight, trying so hard to sound patient and in control. He launched into a completely different explanation, something about a proactive family trust and optimizing tax liabilities. His story and Alyssa's didn't just disagree, they were from different planets. And in that moment, seeing the panicked look they exchanged, I knew for certain. They weren't just desperate, they were amateurs. Their carefully constructed image of being savvy, competent professionals was a lie. Their failure to trick me changed everything. Caleb said he was coming over immediately. When he arrived, the mask was gone. There were no smiles, no gentle reassurances. His face was a thundercloud. He told me I was clearly getting confused, that my conversation with Susan proved I was vulnerable and couldn't tell friend from foe. For my own protection, he said he was going to simplify things. He walked over to the wall and unplugged my landline telephone, the cord dangling uselessly. He told me it was to prevent scammers from taking advantage of me. From now on, he said all my important calls could be routed through his cell phone. He would be my filter. He would keep me safe. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. The trap had been sprung. After they left, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. I was alone, cut off. For the first time, a genuine sliver of fear pierced through my anger. They were isolating me, building the walls of my prison higher. I walked into Robert's old study, running my hand over the back of his worn leather chair. He had always been the worrier, the man with a backup plan for his backup plan. And that's when I remembered. Tucked away in the back of his bottom desk drawer, beneath a pile of old tax returns, was a small, dusty box. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, nestled in cardboard, was a cheap pay-as-you-go cell phone and its charger still in the original plastic. He had bought it years ago, just in case of an emergency. A secret lifeline. I plugged it into the wall behind the desk, out of sight. As the small screen lit up, I didn't just see a charging battery. I saw a fighting chance. The next day was Tuesday. The deadline. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The silence from the unplugged landline was a constant nagging reminder of my new reality. When Caleb and Alyssa arrived that morning, their strategy had shifted. The anger from yesterday was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of patronizing concern. They had decided I wasn't an adversary. I was a problem to be managed. They spoke to me in slow, simple sentences, as if I were a toddler. Alyssa took it upon herself to go through my mail for me, telling me it was to protect me from confusing junk mail, all while I watched her expertly palm a letter from my bank and slip it into her purse. I decided then and there that if they wanted me to be a confused, frail old woman, then that's exactly what they would get. I became the part. I let my shoulders slump. I'd ask them the same question twice in the span of 5 minutes. I even forgot where I'd put the television remote, allowing Alyssa to find it for me with a triumphant, pitying smile. They started talking about me as if I wasn't even in the room, their voices hushed with feigned sympathy. I overheard Caleb telling Alyssa in the kitchen that my episode yesterday was a clear sign of cognitive decline. He said it was a good thing they were stepping in now before I really hurt myself. Their arrogance was a poison, but I let it lull them into a false sense of security. They believed they had won. They thought the situation was under control. But my days were a performance. My nights were for planning. After they'd leave each evening, locking the door behind them for my safety, the real me would emerge. I'd go into Robert's study, the one room they considered too full of dusty old books to be of any value, and I'd lock the door. The little burner phone, my secret lifeline, would come out of its hiding place. Robert. My practical, brilliant Robert had always been prepared. In the false bottom of his old cigar box, I found what I was looking for, a slim file folder. Inside was the original deed to our house free and clear, the paid-off mortgage note stamped in bold red ink. And behind that, something even I had forgotten about the paperwork for an irrevocable trust he had set up a decade ago with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary. The house and everything in it was the property of the trust. My hands, which had trembled with feigned weakness all day, were rock steady as I laid each document on the desk. Using the little phone, I took clear, precise pictures of every single page. The phone's camera was terrible, but it was good enough. I sent the images in a message to Susan Albright, my old lawyer friend. My text was simple. I told her this was what they wanted me to sign over and I needed her help. Then I waited. The minutes stretched into an hour and my heart hammered against my ribs. The house was silent, but my mind was screaming. Finally, the little phone vibrated on the desk. Susan's reply was a long string of messages. She told me in no uncertain terms to absolutely not sign anything. She said the documents I had sent were an ironclad defense. The trust, she explained, made their entire plan legally impossible without my explicit, provable consent. But her last message was the one that made me feel like I could finally breathe again. She told me this was more than just a family squabble. It was financial elder abuse and it was a crime. She said she had already made a call on my behalf. She had reached out to a young, fierce lawyer at a legal aid society that specialized in exactly these kinds of situations. She promised me this lawyer was the best. She told me help was coming. I sat there in the dark, the phone screen lighting up my face. For the first time in days, the fear was replaced by a surge of strength. They thought I was a confused old woman. They thought they had isolated me. But they had no idea that I wasn't alone. I had Robert's foresight, Susan's loyalty, and now a professional fighter was about to step into my corner. I carefully deleted the messages powered down the phone and hid it away. As the first hints of dawn appeared in the window, I went to my bedroom. I was exhausted, but it was the deep, satisfying exhaustion of a soldier who had spent the night preparing the battlefield. Tomorrow I would be frail again. But I knew a storm was coming, and I was the one directing the clouds. The next 2 days were a masterclass in acting. I was the very picture of a woman fading away a ghost in my own home. I moved slowly, spoke softly, and let a vacant look settle in my eyes. Caleb and Alyssa were constantly present, their concern now a weapon they used to justify their control. They brought in brochures for assisted living facilities, spreading them on the coffee table and talking about the benefits of, say, 24-hour care and managed social activities. They discussed the logistics of selling the house, the capital gains tax, all of it right in front of me, their voices filled with the pragmatic tones of people handling a sad but necessary business transaction. They believed they had already won. The Tuesday deadline had passed, and I could feel Caleb's desperation radiating off him in waves, but his arrogance still overshadowed it. He thought it was just a matter of time before I broke. On Thursday afternoon, as Alyssa was explaining the benefits of a facility with an on-site hairdresser, it happened. A sharp, official-sounding knock on the front door. It wasn't the gentle tap of a neighbor. It was a knock that demanded to be answered. Caleb went to the door, his face a mask of annoyance. On the porch stood a young woman in a dark, practical suit. She looked to be in her early 30s, her expression calm and her gaze direct. She asked for me, Virginia Fletcher. Caleb immediately puffed up his chest, playing the part of the protective son. He told her his mother was resting and wasn't taking unexpected visitors. He asked if he could take a message. The young woman didn't even blink. She held his gaze and informed him that she wasn't a visitor. She was my legal counsel. My son's condescending smile faltered. The lawyer introduced herself as being from the Senior Legal Aid Society, and then, from a sleek leather briefcase, she produced a document. She presented it to Caleb and stated clearly that it was a cease and desist letter citing potential financial coercion and elder abuse. She finished by saying she was here at my request to have a private consultation with her client. Me. That was the moment the dam broke. The legal threat so official and so public shattered Caleb's fragile composure. It was a complete and total meltdown. He stumbled back into the living room, the paper trembling in his hand, and he just crumbled. He started sobbing great ugly gasps of a man who had been holding his breath for years. And then it all came pouring out. He confessed everything. The mountains of credit card debt to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The disastrous stock investments he'd made trying to catch up to his tech millionaire friends. The crushing pressure to maintain an image of success, an image that was suffocating him. He admitted the Tuesday deadline was a final demand on a high-interest private loan he'd taken out, a loan he had secured against the future sale of my house. He told us through his tears that he was about to lose everything, that his career was a sham, and that my home, my asset, was the only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. Alyssa's reaction was not one of sympathy. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, but it wasn't for her husband's pain. It was for the public humiliation of his failure. Her carefully curated world was imploding, and her first instinct was to find someone to blame. Her voice when she spoke was like shards of ice. She called him weak, pathetic, a failure for getting caught. She spat that she had trusted him to handle it and he had ruined everything. Their toxic partnership dissolved right there in front of me, fracturing into bitter accusations and raw, undisguised contempt for each other. While they were tearing each other apart, I stood up from my armchair. The slump in my shoulders was gone. The vacant look in my eyes was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I walked over to the young lawyer who had been watching the entire scene with a calm, professional detachment. I looked at her, then at my sobbing, broken son. I told her that everything he had just said was true. Then I let the final piece of my performance fall away, and the true me spoke, my voice even and devoid of any emotion. I told my new lawyer that now we needed to discuss the sale of my house. The room fell silent. Caleb's sobs hitched in his throat. Alyssa's face went white. The power in the room had shifted so completely, so irreversibly, it was a physical force. I let them hang in that terrifying silence for a long moment before turning to face them. I told them that we would have one last dinner together here on Friday night. I didn't ask. I commanded. Be there. The day and a half between the confrontation and the final dinner was the quietest I had ever experienced. There were no calls, no visits. It was the unnerving silence of a battlefield after the first volley, with everyone waiting for the final decisive charge. I spent the time packing. Not everything, just the things that mattered. Robert's books, my photograph albums, the few pieces of jewelry my own mother had left me. I hired a moving company with a single phone call, and they took it all away to a storage unit, leaving the house feeling hollow and impersonal. By Friday evening, it was no longer a home. It was a stage. They arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Caleb and Alyssa looked like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, stripped of all their former confidence. They walked into my house not as entitled children, but as condemned prisoners approaching the gallows. My lawyer was already there, seated at the dining table, a silent official witness to the proceedings. I had set the table with my best china, the plates they had always called old-fashioned. In the center of the table was a single pot roast, the very meal they had rejected less than a week ago. The symbolism was not lost on them. We ate in absolute silence. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on plates and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. They barely touched their food. When the meal was over, I did not clear the plates. I left them there, a landscape of our ruined family dinner. I folded my hands on the table and began. My voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of the warmth they had once taken for granted. I started by placing a document in the center of the table and sliding it towards them. It was the thick sheaf of papers they had tried to trick me into signing. Now a huge red stamp crossed the first page, spelling out a single word: void. I explained in simple terms what the document was: a durable power of attorney that would have given them total control over every aspect of my life. My lawyer, I added, had advised me that their methods constituted a clear case for financial fraud. Next, I laid down a second document. This one was a legally filed restraining order. I informed them that effective at the end of our meeting, they were prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or my new residence, wherever that may be. They were not to contact me by phone, email, or any other means. Their access to my life was now officially and permanently terminated. Alyssa made a small, strangled noise, but I ignored it. The third document was an itemized bill. I had my lawyer help me prepare it. It listed the market price of the expensive takeout they'd brought to insult me. It included a consulting fee for the hours I had spent sleepless with worry. It even had a line item for emotional distress. It wasn't about the money. It was about making them understand that every action has a price. They had treated me as a transaction, and I was simply giving them the final invoice. They stared at the papers, their faces a mixture of disbelief and terror. But I had saved the best for last. I slid one final document across the polished wood of the table. It was an official closing statement from a title company. I explained that while they had been busy plotting and panicking, I had been busy making phone calls. My lawyer had found a cash buyer, an investor who had been wanting to get into the neighborhood for years. The house, I told them, had been sold 2 days ago. The money, every last penny, was already safely deposited into the irrevocable trust Robert had created. A trust, I added, that their names were nowhere near. A trust they could never, ever touch. That was what finally broke them. The reality of it, the speed, the finality crashed down on them. They were homeless. They were in ruin. The begging began then. It was ugly, primal. Caleb, his face streaked with tears, finally called me Mom, his voice cracking as he pleaded for forgiveness, for another chance. Alyssa, her mask of contempt gone, was reduced to desperate, incoherent bargaining, promising they would change, that they would make it right. But their apologies were worthless to me now. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were sorry for how it had ended. I listened to their pleas, and I felt absolutely nothing. The part of my heart that had loved them was a cold, dead stone. When they had cried themselves into a choked silence, I stood up. My voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute finality. I told them the new owners would be taking possession on Monday morning. Trash day, I reminded them, is Monday. You have until then to clear out your things. I walked to the sideboard, picked up the last 2 items, and returned to the table. I placed a single one-way train ticket in front of them, its destination clearly printed, Port Townsend. I told them I was leaving tomorrow to start my new life. Then I looked at the broken man who used to be my son. Goodbye, Caleb. After my final words, I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked into Robert's study, closing the door on the wreckage of my family. I heard my lawyer's calm, professional voice speaking to them, the sounds of their choked sobbing, and then finally, the sound of the front door closing. I stayed in that room until long after midnight, not thinking, just feeling the great aching emptiness of a limb that has been amputated to save the body. The next morning, I packed a single suitcase with the essentials for my first few days. I walked through the hollowed-out rooms of my house one last time, my footsteps echoing in the unfamiliar emptiness. It was no longer my home. It was just a property, an asset, waiting for its new owners. I didn't look back as I closed the door behind me. I wasn't there to see what happened on Sunday. My friend Susan told me about it later, piecing together the story from neighbors who had watched the whole pathetic spectacle. She said they showed up in a cheap rented U-Haul, their faces pale and furious. They threw their expensive belongings into the back of the truck with a frantic, graceless haste. The carefully curated image of the successful minimalist power couple was shattered for all to see, replaced by the ugly reality of two people being evicted. The neighbors who had only ever seen their perfect smiles and expensive cars stood on their lawns and watched the entire humiliating performance. Their social standing, the very thing they had been willing to destroy me for, evaporated on that suburban street under the bright morning sun. By then, I was miles away, sitting on a train watching the green landscape of Washington roll by. With every mile that passed, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift. I was watching the skyline of my old life, a life of quiet duty and growing unease, shrink into the distance. I was heading towards the sea, towards a small town I'd only ever visited with Robert, a place that had always felt like a deep, calming breath. I was leaving Virginia Fletcher, the widow and the mother, behind. I was on my way to becoming simply Virginia. A few months later, Susan came to visit me in Port Townsend. My new home was a small cottage, just 2 rooms with a wide porch that looked out over the water. It was all I needed. As we sat on the porch sipping tea, she filled me in on the rest. News travels fast in communities like Bellevue, especially when it involves money and scandal. The story, she said, had taken on a life of its own. Caleb and Alyssa were social pariahs. They were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the freeway, their relationship reportedly strained to the breaking point by constant, bitter arguments about whose fault it all was. They had lost the house, their friends, and the respect of everyone who knew them. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, drowning in the debt and resentment they had brought upon themselves. I listened, but I felt a strange sense of distance from it all, as if she were telling me about characters in a book I'd once read. Their fate was no longer my concern. My life was here now. It was quiet, and it was mine. The silence in my cottage wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. The emptiness wasn't lonely. It was full of possibility. After Susan left, I sat on my porch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple over the calm water. My little burner phone, now my regular phone, rang beside me. It was Susan again, laughing, asking if I was still on for volunteering at the library fundraiser next week. I told her, of course I was. We chatted for a few more minutes, making plans, talking about books, the silly things friends talk about. After I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, pulling a soft quilt over my legs. I held the warm mug of tea in my hands, watched the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, and took a deep, clean breath of the salty air. I was free. I was in control. And for the first time in a very long time, I was truly home. Treating family like a convenience is a dangerous gamble, one that assumes love is an unbreakable contract. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite consequence. A lifetime of being taken for granted can be undone in a single moment of clarity. When pushed too far, the quietest person will finally find their voice, not to argue, but to deliver a final verdict. The lesson often learned too late is that a true inheritance isn't just property you are given, but the respect you have earned. When that is squandered, you are left with nothing.